Welcome to lesson 3 of this series on the Sermon on the Mount. Today we're going to study Matthew chapter 5 verses 27 to 37, and we're going to talk about love and holiness in the kingdom. And so let's go ahead and get started with Matthew chapter 5 verses 27 and 28. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And so Jesus is going through this series of contrasts, comparing what the people have heard about the law versus what Jesus himself was teaching about God's law. Now, the scribes and the Pharisees and the other teachers of the law, they had taught their own traditions and interpretations of God's law. But over the centuries, there was so much teaching of tradition and interpretation of the law that they had forgotten what the true meaning of God's law really was. And so Jesus was trying to get back to that true meaning of God's law. Now, in the last lesson, we saw how the Pharisees and the scribes were trying to practice their form of righteousness, but they were really only focusing on their outward behaviors, their appearance of righteousness. And while our outward behaviors are still important, Jesus was emphasizing that our internal attitudes of righteousness are also important. And just as the internal attitudes of anger and insults and devaluing other human beings is also another form of murder, so the internal attitude of lustful intent is also another form of adultery. Now, what are we supposed to do about it then? So Jesus tells us in verses 29 to 30, "If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell." Now, Jesus is talking about cutting off sin in order to maintain holiness. And so he can say that we're supposed to tear out our right eye if it causes us to sin, and to cut off our right hand if it causes us to sin. Now, talking about all this cutting off of body parts can seem so barbaric, but it's important to understand that Jesus is teaching us to be so serious about it because the sin of adultery is so serious. Now, the original judgment for adultery in the Bible was putting the adulterers to death. Now, this we see in the book of Leviticus chapter 20, for example, in verse 10. It says, "If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death." But the whole chapter of Leviticus 20 describes a variety of sexual sins, not just relations with your neighbor's wife, but also relations with your mother-in-law, with your daughter-in-law, or various other cases, even relations with animals. All of these sins were to be judged by putting the person to death. And the idea was cutting off the evil in order to maintain holiness. Now, in the Old Testament, God was trying to build a holy society with holy people. So the sinful activity must be cut off before it spreads. Now, as it says later in Leviticus 20, verse 26, it says, "You shall be holy to me. For I, the Lord, am holy and have separated you from the peoples that you should be mine." This Old Testament concept of cutting off the evil in order to maintain holiness, Jesus applies this idea on an individual level at the end of verse 30. He says, "For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell." And so Jesus' big picture idea is that in order to maintain our personal holiness, sometimes we need to cut off the part in order to save the whole. But if that's Jesus' point, we need to ask the question, what is the part that we're supposed to cut off? Now, one thing is for sure, we are not supposed to literally cut off our body parts. Unfortunately, not everyone knew that. Most famously, Origen, one of the church fathers of the 3rd century, castrated himself in an effort to control his lusts. But we know for sure that Jesus didn't mean for us to cut off any body parts. For one thing, it just doesn't work. Even if you did tear out your right eye, you would still have your left eye that you could engage in sin. And even if you did cut off your right hand, you would still have your left hand with which you could sin. But more than that, Jesus says from the beginning that it's not mainly a problem with your eye or with your hand. Mainly, it's a problem of your heart. That the heart is a source of your intent. And so we can think of the heart also as the source of our desires. And so if you were really to cut off a part of your body to keep you from sinning, you would need to cut out your heart. And of course you can't do that. And so what are we supposed to cut off? I think Jesus gives us a hint by emphasizing the right eye and the right hand. In the Bible, the right side can sometimes symbolize strength, the best part of something. And so by referring to the right eye, Jesus could be using that as a representation of everything you see. Or even beyond what you see, you can think of the right eye as a representation of all of your thoughts. And in a similar way with the right hand is not just the actions that you take with that individual hand, but it's a representation of all of your actions. And so we have to realize that, yes, of course, the things we see with our eyes can cause us to sin, and the things we do with our hands can cause us to sin. But it's not just about what you see and do. If the battle for sin and holiness is really a matter of both outward behaviors and internal attitudes, then you could even tear out both eyes, you could even cut out both hands, but you would still fall into sin with your heart. So Jesus' point is not that you have to somehow control one eye or one hand or else cut them off. Really, his point is to control your desires and your thoughts and your actions. In terms of application then, you can ask yourself, what desires, thoughts, and actions need to be cut off, and particularly need to be cut off from your life. Now, I believe Jesus uses such shocking language so that we can understand how important and how urgent it is to control our lusts. Sometimes we do need to cut out certain desires and certain thoughts and certain actions out of our lives. And just like cutting off our right hand, sometimes it can be really inconvenient or even painful to make such drastic changes in our lives. Now, this can be particularly difficult because our modern society has adopted this concept that our lives are supposed to be convenient and we're supposed to have all the freedom that we want. To limit our personal freedom and our self-fulfillment is sometimes treated like a sin in itself. And the only thing worse than denying ourselves of our personal freedoms is to allow ourselves to suffer. In today's modern society, there seems to be no acceptable place for suffering. But cutting off the sinful desires and thoughts and actions from our lives, even at the cost of suffering and inconvenience, is so important and requires such drastic measures because the stakes are so high. Just as Jesus says at the end in verse 30, "For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell." Now let's go on with verses 31 and 32. "It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now here in this section, Jesus is dealing with the issue of divorce. Now this is a very short passage, but it's such an important topic and a very complicated topic. And so I want to spend a little more time on the biblical background of what Jesus is teaching here. In particular, I'm going to refer to a few different Bible passages. First in Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 to 9. And then Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 to 4. And then finally 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 12 through 16. And so let's turn to those passages now. In Matthew chapter 19, Jesus is having a detailed conversation with the Pharisees on the topic of divorce. Starting in verse 3, "And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female?" And so where did they read that? Jesus here is quoting from Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. And then he goes on and said, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." And so here Jesus is quoting Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. And then, "So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." And so the idea here is that divorce should not be allowed for just any old reason, because Adam and Eve, the first husband and wife, became one flesh, and it was God who joined them together. But the Pharisees respond to Jesus, starting in verse 7. They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." And so Jesus again affirms the biblical reason for divorce in terms of sexual immorality. Now, I've often had a problem with this passage because it sounds like Jesus is contradicting Moses. So I wanted to go back into what Moses actually said to see if Jesus is really contradicting Moses or something else is going on. So the Pharisees were actually referring to this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. Now you can read that on your own, but basically what Moses is saying, he's not condoning divorce for any old reason, but he specifically says that the divorce is because a husband has found some indecency in the wife. And so this certificate of divorce is just the legal proceeding for the divorce. It's not a moral justification for the divorce. For Moses, his justification for divorce is the same as Jesus' justification, sexual immorality. And by the way, Moses brings up the same idea of cutting off sin in order to maintain holiness, or cutting off the part in order to save the whole. He says at the end of the passage, "And you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance." And so it's this same idea of cutting off sin in order to maintain holiness. So far, what we see is that sexual immorality is definitely one legitimate reason for a biblical divorce. And in Matthew chapter 5, that was in the context of adultery. Now, there is another reason for divorce that the Apostle Paul explains in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. "To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him." In Jesus' time, he was talking mostly to Jews. So the idea of an unbeliever and a believer marrying together didn't exist yet when Jesus was teaching. But in Paul's day, it was happening a lot that there would be a husband and a wife, and maybe just one spouse became a believer. If the non-Christian spouse agrees to stay, Paul is saying that the Christian spouse should not seek a divorce. But if the non-Christian spouse wants to separate, Paul instructs that this is a legitimate reason for divorce. Look at verses 15 and 16. "But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or the sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?" Now, in modern terms, we call this abandonment. And this is another biblical reason for divorce. And within abandonment, most Christians will also include cases of abuse. Abuse is also a biblical reason for divorce. So these are two of the commonly accepted biblical reasons for divorce: sexual immorality, which includes adultery, and abandonment, which includes abuse. But I wanted to point out one more thing that Paul says in the middle of the passage. He makes this interesting statement in verse 14. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Now it's interesting that in Leviticus and Deuteronomy you had this idea of cutting off the part in order to save the whole, or cutting off what is unholy in order to maintain holiness. But here Paul is saying, keep the holy and unholy together, and the unholy will be made holy. Instead of the unholy spreading to the holy part, now here we see it is holiness that's spreading. The holiness will spread and overtake the unholy part. So it's not necessary to divorce because the Christian spouse has the opportunity to share about Jesus and raise the children in the faith so that the rest of the family can be made holy too. In the Old Testament, you had to cut off the sin because the sin is the thing that spreads. But now in the New Testament, the influence goes in the opposite direction, that holiness is the thing that will spread. So back in our passage in Matthew 5, while it's true that we need to cut off the part in order to save the whole, it's also true that Jesus has the power to save the part by binding it to the whole. In the context of Jesus' teaching here, he is talking about marriage and maintaining the marriage relationship. But he's also talking about holiness and maintaining holiness in our relationship with God. So to bring these two topics together, we can think about the application of binding love. Our only strategy in maintaining holiness is not just cutting off one thing and another thing, although there are definitely times in our lives when it's necessary to cut off sinful desires and thoughts and actions. But another strategy is not just maintaining holiness, but it's spreading holiness. It's not just cutting off from the whole, but binding on to the whole. And so love is the thing that binds us. And in the context of Jesus' teaching here on marriage, we can think about the love of marriage as a model for us to apply this idea of spreading holiness. First of all, love in marriage is commitment. That's why Jesus is so strict in teaching against divorce. Marriage is this unique and exclusive relationship in which you commit your whole lives to one another, and you can never break that commitment. In marriage, you also have vulnerability. In marriage, you share everything with each other and reveal every part of yourself to the other, all your strengths and all your weaknesses. But once you have vulnerability, you also have acceptance. With every other person in the world, we guard ourselves against vulnerability because we're afraid that if people really see our weaknesses and failures, they'll not accept us and they'll judge us instead. But your husband or your wife is the one person in the world who should be able to see all of your weaknesses and all of your vulnerability and still accept you completely without judgment. And just as a side note, in a marriage where there is a Christian spouse who's trying to share about Jesus to their non-Christian spouse, a lot of times it can be the lack of vulnerability and the lack of acceptance that's the biggest barrier for that spouse to believe in Jesus. The Christian spouse may think that they have to live a perfect, holy life in order to be a good example to their non-Christian spouse. So instead of being vulnerable, they hide their faults. And instead of accepting their non-Christian spouse, they often judge them in an effort to somehow make them become more Christian. Now, the irony is, though, that the lack of vulnerability and the lack of acceptance will actually drive them away from Christ, not towards Him. And finally, in this model of binding love in marriage in order to grow in holiness, there's also joy. Jesus' image of tearing out an eye or cutting off a hand, that's not a joyful image at all. But the binding love of marriage should be a joyful image, that it's not just our painful sacrifice that maintains holiness, but it's our joy in being with our beloved that drives us to more and more holiness. So in terms of application, think about it in your own life. You can examine your relationship with your spouse. if you have this kind of commitment and vulnerability, this kind of acceptance and joy, you can also examine your relationship with God. If your relationship with God also is characterized by this commitment, vulnerability, acceptance, and joy, that these things are driving you towards holiness. Now we've come to our last section of the text, so let's go ahead and read verses 33 through 37. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn." But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. Jesus is talking about the issue of swearing falsely. And you might think that, what does this have to do with marriage or holiness? But listen to Jesus' reasoning for not taking oaths at all. You can't swear by heaven because it belongs to God. You can't swear by earth because it belongs to God. You can't swear by Jerusalem because it belongs to God. You can't even swear by your own head. You don't even have the power to make your even one hair white or black. And so you don't even own your own head, but that belongs to God as well. So because we don't have any ownership of these things, we should simply let our yes be yes and our no be no. And listen to this. Anything more than this comes from evil. Now that's kind of harsh. What does he mean that it comes from evil? Think about the context of the passage. Jesus started off talking about adultery and lustful intent. He talks about sin and sexual immorality. Is lying really on the level of that kind of evil? What Jesus is saying here is that it all comes from the same basic attitude. This evil comes from the attitude of claiming what does not belong to you. Once you get married, there's one person in all the world who belongs to you. But when you commit adultery, or even when you have lustful intent in your heart, in your eyes, in your hands, you are desiring something that doesn't belong to you. And it's the same thing when you swear falsely. You're claiming authority on something that doesn't belong to you. And so this becomes another motivation in our pursuit of holiness. In terms of application then, we can remember who you belong to. You can't even claim to own yourself. If that's the case, then who do you belong to? Are you the sinful part that has been cut off to save the whole? Or are you the sinful part that has been bound onto the whole in order to be saved? And how do you know which one you are? So you can ask yourself the question, have you been bound to God? And how do you know if you have? In order to answer this question, we have to go to our last step in the study of God's Word. This is the Jesus factor. Remember that Jesus is not just giving us wise teachings. He's not just giving us interpretations of God's Word. We have to remember that Jesus has not only taught God's Word, he fulfilled God's Word on your behalf. And so let's look now at how Jesus fulfilled the Word in this passage. For any other human being in the world, there's no one who could claim any authority over heaven or earth or Jerusalem or even their own head. But Jesus is not just any other human being. He is the great king over Jerusalem. He's also the great king over all of the earth. And he's even the great king who rules over heaven itself. And for you and I, we can't even change one hair of our head white or black. But Jesus has the authority so much so that he could even raise himself from the dead. And yet even with all of that authority, even with his rightful claim over heaven and earth, look what happened to him. For you and I to keep ourselves from adultery and to keep ourselves from lustful intent, it's necessary sometimes to tear out our right eye or to cut off our right hand. ultimately what it means is we even have to cut out our own heart to keep ourselves in maintaining our own holiness. It's necessary to cut off the part in order to save the whole. And yet Jesus was that part that was cut off in order to save the whole. Jesus himself was the part that was cut off so that we could be saved. We are that part that was saved so that we could be bound to the whole, so that we could be bound to God even. Jesus even experienced the judgment of hell in order to save us. So Jesus fulfills this passage with the understanding that Jesus was the part that was cut off so that we could be saved. Are you experiencing this binding love of Jesus? Maybe after all this talk of holiness, instead of love, you're feeling more discouraged. Maybe you're feeling like you are the part that's going to be cut off at any moment. And maybe your first reaction is, I've got to try harder. I've got to get it right this time. And of course, we do need to continue to do our best. But ultimately, it was Jesus who was cut off on our behalf. So depend upon him, knowing that through faith in him, he gives you his perfect holiness. He does actually remove your old and sinful heart, and he gives you a new heart in its place. And the more and more you receive Jesus' grace through faith, it has the power to spread his holiness not just to your heart, but to your hands and to your eyes as well.